Hello, you magnificent bastards! Glad you tuned in. There is a little something that I wanted to talk about for a while now, and thank you Griffix for giving me a platform to do so. Let's talk about racism.
That's racist!
Yay! And before I turn this video off, let me make one thing clear. I'm not using racist or racism as a slur, insult, or a political buzzword. I use it strictly as a description. Now, we all roughly know what racism is: prejudice or antagonism against an individual or a group of people based on their perceived race. This is actually an absolutely fine definition for any colloquial conversation, but I think we should try and nuance it a little bit more. There isn't just racism, but there is input and output racism. Might not sound like a big difference, but it actually is. Input racism is the one racism we are all very much familiar with. It's basically prejudice or antagonism against an individual or a group of people based on characteristics associated with their perceived race. The main focus here being on supposedly inherent biological traits, their biological input, so to say. In such a framework, even a person who shows none of the despised social, cultural, or economical characteristics is to be antagonized, even if the person shows characteristics that are normally associated with a superior race or races. To put it bluntly, an input racist sees no difference between those two. This means if you're an input racist against people who we'll call, for simplicity's sake, black, it doesn't matter to you if the person showing these characteristics is well-adjusted, wealthy, polite, well-spoken, charitable, honorable, or any number of other positive characteristics. The person is still inferior on a biological level and is to be antagonized. This concept is also sometimes referred to as biological racism or racism proper, but more on that later. Now, output racism is a bit more complicated and nuanced than that. Contrary to input racism that focuses on alleged inherent biological traits, output racism focuses on the social, economical, and cultural output of the targeted race. This is basically where the terms input and output come from. The input racist cares about the biological input, the output racist cares about the social, economical, and cultural output. While output racism sometimes acknowledges a biological component, it always works under the assumption that nurture usually beats nature, or at least that it potentially can. In this framework, individuals that do not show the social, cultural, or economical characteristics that are normally associated with their race in a negative way are not viewed as inferior. For instance, if you are output racist against blacks, you will not view the well-adjusted, wealthy, polite, friendly, charitable, educated, and so on and so forth person next to you as inferior, even if that person exhibits biological traits of a black person. You will, however, antagonize any person that shows both the biological and the associated social, cultural, or economical characteristics. This whole concept is also often referred to as social or cultural racism, but I think that those terms don't really show how much consideration actually goes into it. Same for the term biological racism. So I prefer the wider terminology of input and output racism. So why does all of this matter? It matters because of two reasons mainly. First, the colloquial term racism is simply not nuanced enough. For instance, an input racist that wants to get rid of all black people, regardless of how awesome they might be, or might not be, is quite simply not the same as an output racist who simply want the, let's say, troublesome parts of the black community to behave. Input racism allows for much more severe policies on a much wider scale, including discrimination by law, mass deportation, and, if taken to its absolute extreme, genocide. Output racism is much milder and softer. There essentially is only very little room for unequal treatment before the law, and most importantly, there is an end to it. After sufficient integration, output racism simply loses all ground it ever had and stops existing. If there is no negative cultural output you could antagonize, there quite simply is no basis for output racism. And if you want an example for all of this, let's just look at Black Lives Matter. The input racist will see them as biologically compelled to chimp out, loot and riot, and there is no amount of money, education or integration that could fix this. The output racist might see a biological component in their behavior, but at the same time he'll be convinced that with enough motivation, be it positive or negative, they too can stop chimping out, looting and rioting. Alrighty then, that's actually all I had planned for today. Graphics, again, thank you so much for having me on. Always a pleasure working with a cute Source Hollandaise like you. Glad you guys tuned in, and as always, Babylon prevails.